Sarah and I met at a meeting for women filmmakers called Bay Area Women in Film and Media. It's sort of a monthly get-together of women who are doing all different kinds of filmmaking. It's a chance to network, and this particular night, Sarah was showing some footage that she had begun to gather at the racetrack. I had a newborn son at the time. I wasn't really getting out that often, but I kind of, by fate, decided, you know what, I'm going to drive up to San Francisco tonight. I'm going to go to this meeting. I'm just going to try to sort of stay involved in whatever ways I can, even though I have a really young baby. So I went up to the meeting, and she showed the footage, and I was blown away. You know, I'm Chicana. I live in the Bay Area. My films and my projects are almost always about the Latino community. So I sort of felt like I know this community and I know our stories, and I'd never heard this story before. So I was really, really intrigued. You know, it was like this whole community of people living on the backside of the racetrack, something I'd never seen before. So we got to talking, and at the time she was looking for an editor. She was just beginning. She had interviewed several workers. She hadn't really focused yet on the family that ends up being the sort of main focus of the project as it evolved. They were in there, but they were among many different workers. And she asked me if I'd be interested in coming on board the project as an editor. She needed a Spanish-speaking editor. She herself did not speak Spanish, was always working with an interpreter, so it was very helpful, you know, that I could speak Spanish. So we started working together then, and I worked with her as the editor for a couple of years on the project as we really focused more on the family, but very quickly my role transitioned into being one of producer. Because I am Spanish speaking and I would be on the set and we would be interviewing the family, I began to sort of develop that relationship with Dionisia and Mario and the boys. So it sort of simplified things to have someone who was intimately involved in the project being able to communicate with them. So we worked more as a team from that point forward, doing a lot of the production stuff. I stayed involved as the editor. We ended up being accepted to the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, does a Producers Academy every year, and by then we had cut enough material together to be accepted to their 1-week academy, and they provide mentoring, editing mentors, producing mentors, and at that time we met Herb Ferret, he was our editing mentor. He ended up becoming the editor of the actual film. So that was another sort of lucky coincidence and collaboration that came out of that. So just to make a very long story long, I started as the editor, and then I transitioned into being the producer as the film progressed. It took us about 5 years to, all told, to complete the film from pre-production to post-production. And on a small documentary film, everybody wears a lot of hats,
right.
And I did.
You get involved with films that really speak to you, that are, what was the term you used? Sort of activism projects.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about some of the other projects you've been involved in?
Sure. So I feel like my identity as a documentary filmmaker has really solidified over the last years because I've always been an activist. I mean, I've always been interested in issues of justice. Before I was a filmmaker, I was a community organizer, and I worked on issues of violence against women and girls. It was actually how I got into filmmaking, was producing a video for the nonprofit I was working for then. And that project was just so exciting. It was one of those epiphany moments where I realized that filmmaking might really be my path, and that I'd always loved movies, I'd always loved media as a tool for communication, and it kind of clicked for me that it would be a really good tool for activism as well, because I think video speaks to people. A lot of people are visually oriented. It's a way to package information that's, you know, sort of attractive and appealing and relatable. You can show human stories and people really can connect with the characters, and then my hope is once they've connected on a sort of heart level with the characters, then they can be motivated to take action on the issue in the film. So it was just a natural fit for me, I think, with what had always been sort of my interest in activism and working for justice issues. So previous films that I did, it's an interesting combination of sort of autobiographical stuff. I am Latina, and so you know, if I'm telling my own story, it's going to involve girls of color. I went sort of all the way back to early films I did. I did a film about women of color who were cheerleaders in high school who went on to become community activists. I've been an organizer for so many years in the Bay Area, so I featured 3 women of color that I had worked with or that I knew from my personal networks. And it was also multi-generational because I was an organizer with senior citizens for several years. So I found this wonderful older African-American woman named Jerry who'd been a cheerleader sort of back in the segregation era South. And she
Wow.
talked about, her experiences of being a cheerleader and going to a segregated school. And I knew her as this hardcore, senior citizen activist in San Francisco. So I had a lot of fun making the links between the ability to do public speaking, chanting at rallies, chanting at football games, and I just sort of really played with this conception because I had come from this sort of radical feminist background as an organizer, and I think a lot of people feel like that means you're supposed to be one thing. It's supposed to look a certain way, the stereotype they have about what that means about you as a person. And I just thought, you know what, we all contain multitudes. And when I would say to people, oh yeah, I was a cheerleader in high school, they would be completely blown away because it didn't fit with their feminist vision of who I should be. So I thought it was really fun because the reason I'm okay with public speaking is because I did that stuff in high school.
So
I was
you were a cheerleader?
I was, and so that's the personal element, and there's always a personal angle. My mother was cleaning out the house I grew up in, and she said, I was in film school, and she said, you need to come down and clean out your room. Anything that you don't come and claim, I'm going to get rid of it. And so I was going through my childhood room, and my cheerleading uniforms were in there, and it just kind of clicked for me, this funny conversation around being a feminist and being a cheerleader, and what does that mean? My mother had been a song leader in high school, so she was in the film as well. So I included my mom, my friend Jerry, the senior I mentioned, and then a girlfriend of mine named Rosie Reyes, who was an organizer with farm workers and here in the Bay Area.
Wow.
She'd been a cheerleader in San Francisco at an all-girls high school. So it was a really fun combination of stories. And then I found some radical feminist cheerleaders in New York City who were performance artists, and it was all feminist cheers. So they used the form of traditional cheerleading, they're in uniforms, and the cheers were hysterical. They were really funny, they were really intense, kind of taking on serious women's issues of childcare and wage inequity, and they were just great. So I flew out and filmed them in New York City, and I incorporated that with my interviews with the women of color in my story, and a little bit of my own story, although I don't really reveal I was a cheerleader till the very final moment in the piece. And so for me, it was like, that's a perfect example of like, I want to take social issues, I want to examine them if I can, I want to have a lot of fun while I'm doing that, I want to help people, as I say, open their hearts, laugh, let the issues kind of in on a personal level so they can really start thinking about what it means. So that one was, there's no sort of call to action that I was asking people to do with that piece, but it was like, think about this, let's redefine femininity, let's redefine feminism, let's think about activism, let's think about the role of women of color in our culture and in our community, and recognize too what great leaders they are and what power they have. So that's an example of an early project of mine that started me on this path very, very early of thinking about what are some radical ways that I can show people of color on screen. My undergraduate degree, I went to UC Berkeley, and my undergraduate degree was in psychology and Chicano studies. And I worked with battered women at a battered women's shelter, and my senior thesis was on developing better services for Spanish-speaking families. So I really thought I was probably going to become a psychologist. That was sort of the direction I was headed in, working in the Latino community. But then I got out into the world, I lived abroad, I lived in Mexico for a while, I came back, and I got the job doing the organizing work on violence against women and girls issues. And that really set my trajectory as an activist and as a community-based organizer. Did that for several years, worked with the senior citizens in San Francisco as an organizer, had that epiphany moment around making films, and so I decided to part-time start going back to a local community college and just explore and decide and say, is this something I want to pursue or not? Very quickly it was obvious to me it was what I wanted to pursue. I met Meadow Holmes, who has become a major collaborator of mine for the last 15 years. She was a college student, and I was older, I was in my 20s by then. And I decided to apply to film school because there were two reasons. I knew I wanted to make films, and you can become a filmmaker without a formal education. You can apprentice, you can learn the tools, you can study, sort of independently. It is an apprentice-based field, potentially. But I knew that I wanted to be a teacher. I've always loved being a teacher and a trainer in a variety of capacities, and if I had the master's degree, then I knew that I could teach at the university level down. And I knew community-based teaching was what I wanted to do. That was a huge part. I wanted to empower people to use these tools. So I said, you know what, I'm going to go to film school, I'm going to get the formal education, I'm going to have the degree behind me, so then my options will be open in terms of my own career, my own choices. So I was in my late 20s when I went to film school, finished up in my early 30s. So yeah, it was, I was young enough, but it was sort of a second career path for me. Fundamentally, I would say if you have a passion for this, you need to start making stuff, right? And it may not be the best stuff in the world in the beginning, because like any art form, it takes practice, and you need to, try to carry through your vision and learn the skills along the way. Locally, I'm a huge fan of Create TV San Jose. I was on the board there for 5 years. I'm a founding board member, and the mission of that organization is to empower the community to be able to produce media, to tell their own stories. Basically it's a free speech proposition, right? We want people to be able to get the tools, to not be intimidated by the technology, to not let that keep you from telling your story. So at Create TV San Jose, for example, like at many community access stations throughout the country, you can rent equipment at a very low cost, you can take training classes, so you can begin to learn how do you use the camera, how do you edit in Final Cut Pro, how do you use After Effects, how do you direct, what do you think about when you're producing a documentary, how do you conduct a good interview. That's all stuff you learn along the way, but you can take some classes to kind of jumpstart and professionalize your approach. And then I think it's also really important to have mentors, and that's something that I've tried really, really hard to do in my development as a filmmaker, and sort of as I've gotten a little more seasoned. I've been doing this for, a decade and a half, I think, at this point. I try to find, particularly women, because I'm really invested in women learning this career, I try to find young women who I think are talented but maybe are anxious or nervous about the leadership component, or often the technology component stumps people. They think they're not technically inclined, and to me it's like, don't let that keep you from, look, it's get out the manual, get in there, try stuff, find people that know how to use it and they'll help you out, but that should never keep you from creating art, right? It's like, it's just a machine, and you can learn how to master these machines, and you can find people who are very, very good at using these machines to collaborate with you. If you're more of a director-producer type, you can surround yourself by really skilled people. If you're good at communicating your vision, that can work. But I think people can get training along the way. They should find mentors who want to help them, sort of guide them through the process, and they should find friends who want to collaborate with them, who can sort of support them along the way.